Hamza, it is characteristic of many scientists that they prefer not to have science and religion conflict and work towards harmonization by putting them so totally separate that there's really no association together. I kind of look upon that sometimes as a cop-out. If there is a problem, we should address it. The classic area that has been of concern is obviously evolution, where certain aspects, probably more in Christianity than in other religions today, certain facets of it reject evolution, and a small segment of that group would claim to have scientific evidence for it. But there's a kind of a driving passion that thinks they need it in order to maintain the infallibility of the totality of the both the Hebrew and the Christian Bible, which the Christians all accept. I do believe that the Islamic tradition treats the Quran as fully inspired. And if that's the case, how do you deal with evolution?
So, Bismillah, first of all, I think certain scientists view, Stephen Jay Gould had the two magisteria, this idea of, religion has its own magisterium and then science has its own magisterium, and never the twain shall meet. The Muslims would reject that if it's true science, it has to be compatible with the Quran. The Quran cannot, because God created the world, and He created the world with this logos, with this intelligibility. And so if there's something in the Quran that contradicts science, either the Quran is not true or the science isn't true. It's one or the other. So for Muslims, they would say the science has to be wrong because but it can't be incompatible. So Muslims have never had a problem with science. They've never persecuted scientists. They've always promoted science. And I think some of the strongest Muslims today are people that are in the sciences themselves, in the STEM areas. Engineers, doctors.
No, for sure that's the case. I think we all know that. But the question comes back, if you have a fundamental approach to the scripture and there is something that would be contradictory, a true Muslim would say there's something wrong with science. There's not something wrong with...
And about evolution, I mean, you asked me about evolution. There's a famous story of a great West African scholar who was teaching in Saudi Arabia and Medina. His name's Muhammad al-Amin al-Shinqiti. And when the Americans went to the moon, the Mauritanians were shocked because the Quran says that the moon is in the heavens and they can't penetrate the heavens. And so they came to him and they said, what does this mean? And he said, well, it means either they're lying or we misunderstood the Quran.
That's a good answer.
It is true. It's a good answer.
Mutually exhaustive.
And so generally, the view is that they misunderstood the Quran, so that verse doesn't apply to the heavens that can't be penetrated. It only applies to the lower heaven. And that's the position that they took. So with evolution, evolution is obviously, there are different iterations of evolution. There's evolution, we see the virus that afflicted our species recently evolved. Because you had the Delta, and then you had this and that. And,
Omicron.
Omicron. So the idea that things don't mutate, they don't evolve, I think is absolutely undeniable. Now, did we come from a previous species? Did we begin in some cosmic swamp and lightning struck that swamp and then somehow the beginning of a cell emerged and evolved over time until we got to this complexity? I think most Muslims would not accept that narrative, but there are Muslims now that are taking evolution very seriously. They're studying it. They're coming up with different solutions to it. So I think there is a grappling with evolution, but overall I think the vast majority of Muslims are still very orthodox in their belief, that God created the human being and that we're in the form that God created us.
And that would have been in some close relationship to a simple reading of the book of Genesis?
I think so. That's the way the majority of Muslims would view it.
Yeah, and again, majority belief is interesting sociologically, but I'm interested more in the broad range of scholars, philosophers.
I think there's scholars writing on evolution now. I think Maurice Bucaille wrote a book arguing that evolution was everything, but the human being was dropped into the earth. Yeah. Everything else was done through evolution, but the human being was unique in that he was.
So why I like that, I'm not saying it's true, but why I like that is it's an effort to make a consistent argument, to take two things that look on its surface to be contradictory and say, okay, if I take a firm belief in both, which many people would reject, but if I'm forced to do that, how can I make it work? What are some alternatives to make it work? You may not think the solution is any good, but what would it take to make it work and be faithful to both sides?
Well, I mean, occasionalism is one of the ways, because if God is recreating everything in every instant, and that at a certain point he created man from that evolution, that would have been a unique point. I mean, one of the things that always struck me, they used to do this, they don't do it anymore, and I think somebody wised up to it. You know, when they show Australopithecus, the first little guy, and then they move up, and then at a certain point he's wearing a loincloth. And I mean, how did he discover his nakedness? I mean, that always struck me as very strange about, like, now they took it off, now he's just naked all the way through, because I think they realize that that's a problem, because it kind of is consistent with the Genesis story.
Right. I know, I think those are very good examples. And so the idea of this harmonization, because if we look at the options you have in evolution, you have the pure evolution that's pure random. You run the movie twice and you get a different answer. However many times you run the movie, you get a different result. And human beings are completely accidental. Consciousness is accidental. And I think any religious person in the Abrahamic traditions at least would reject that. Then you have more of a deistic evolution, which some people call theistic, but it's really deistic, which means that God was really smart and put it all together so that humans would evolve according to the laws of chance and everything would happen, but God does not have to intervene further.
Exactly. The world's a washing machine. You put the quarters in.
Yeah, but boy, what a wonderful job in designing that washing machine. Paul Davies, a cosmologist who's not a theist, but has very sophisticated and unusual ideas, would say that that's a God who's really smart. I mean, if you want to believe in God, that kind of God would be the smartest God that you can think of. And I was impressed by that. In other words, it's not that it's a less powerful God because he's not intervening. It's a smarter God who could have made it was so clever to have this system work to bring about what God wanted. So it's a better God.
That's actually one of Darwin's early arguments before he kind of became an atheist. Like, he actually said the evolution is a more marvelous way of viewing God. So in his early period, he kind of, I don't know if he did that just to avoid being attacked by the religious community.
Yeah, and then of course you have a theistic evolution, which says that evolution is true, but God is making interventions and
along the way,
critically, only when needed. Only when needed at those, what they call joints, the joints in the process when you had to make an intervention. And then some would go on to say, but still you can't interrupt the deterministic world, so you have to operate at the quantum world, where there's uncertainty anyway, and so you have a bell curve of distribution.
From our perspective, the uncertainty.
But you have each of these, and then you have people who would be intelligent design. And so you have this spectrum. You have the spectrum of ways of dealing with the problem. And again, my question is, from the Muslim community, in the broader sense, you would skew more to the earlier.
We'd kind of reject them all, I think. I mean, if evolution as it's iterated now, if it was true, The thing that would be absolute disbelief would to believe that it was random from God's perspective. You know, that randomness is impossible for God. God knows. And so if God created a world in which the mechanism with which he chose to fulfill his purpose was through a hit and miss in creation, then that could be possible, but it would not be hit and miss for God. It would just be the mechanism that he chose. And that's the only, for me, the only acceptable perspective for somebody who would adopt a kind of Muslim evolutionary theory. But like I said, most Muslims are going to stick with the traditional narrative.